Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father John Lovell, Hope in the Desert. Would like to thank very much Dan Seveny as well as his son Matthias Seveny. I keep doing that. I keep wanting to call you Matthew. I am so sorry. Matthias Seveny for being the producer. This podcast is a sub-production of the Restoring Christian Initiative podcast, and we're back with part 2 with Father Vaughn Treco. Father Treco, welcome back.
Good to be back.
It's we had such a good conversation last time that we decided to keep going with it and decided to do another recording. And we wanted to discuss specifically the steps involved with you being canceled. And I think a lot of people don't realize what misjustice, I think is the best term to use, and probably the most charitable to use, that the bishops commit against priests when they cancel them. So if we could talk a little bit about not only, we already talked about why the bishop went after you, but how he went after you and the steps that he took to basically ruin your life. And with that said, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, my first conversation with the bishop was first contact with the bishop after the remnant published my sermon was an email from the vicar of clergy at the time, or the vicar general, sorry. And in the email, the vicar general said that what I had said in my sermon was tantamount to heresy. That actually never came up again in our conversations, really, in any substantive way. But it was followed up with a demand that I come to the chancery, which I did a few days later. Then there was a series of email exchanges between Bishop Lopes and myself, where he began to escalate his response to my sermon and my reluctance to cede the point that he wanted me to cede. So finally, we came to a place where he placed 6 demands upon me. 3 of them I was readily able to do in conscience. One of them was a longer term thing that never came to fruition, and the other 2 required that I say publicly that I retracted my sermon and that I therefore believed that something I said was wrong. And I said, I would be happy to do that if you can show to me anything in my sermon that was contrary to the Catholic religion. That evidence was never provided to me. So on January 15th, because of that impasse, Bishop Lopes revoked my faculties to preach and to hear confessions. That was then followed up at the end of January with a suspension, a degree of suspension, and then I think 30 days later, 60 days later, a degree of excommunication he promulgated against me. What was at the heart of all of those were claims that I had said certain things in my sermon that I actually did not say. And so with that, because of the extremity of his actions against me, it kicked in a right in the code that allowed me to submit what's called an appeal to hierarchical recourse. And that was a sort of kindness, an unexpected kindness from the bishop. I don't think he meant to be kind, but because that right kicked in, I was able to, through my canon law, submit an appeal to hierarchical recourse. And according to the code, the moment that appeal is submitted, all of the censures issued against me were lifted or put in suspense, awaiting the judgment of Rome. And that's where we are now. So I'm able to freely live and act as a priest, which is a beautiful kindness to me. So my life began to return to something normal at that point.
Can we pause just for a second? I want to make mention of this because similar to weddings, I think a lot of Catholics in this day and age, part of it's because of lack of catechesis, but part of it's because they watch so many movies and TV shows where they see like a wedding taking place, and they think, well, that's how my wedding should be, or those types of sayings should be in there. One thing that kind of surprises Catholics when they're at a wedding is in a Catholic wedding, you never say, "Does anyone object to the union of this man and woman?" That's foreign to Catholic Mass, but people see it all the time that they just assume that that's part of the rite. And I think also in television as well as in movies, people just assume that all priests are Jesuits and that obedience is a one-way track, that we are privates, the bishops are generals, and the general tells you to do something, you do it without any questions asked. And I don't think people realize that, no, there is a process in the church, especially for secular priests, diocesan priests, and you're very much in that vein as a secular priest, you're not a religious, that no, we do have recourse, that we do have a process that can go through Rome. And we call it hierarchical recourse because we're basically saying, now we're taking this to the bishop's boss. We're taking this to Rome. And while it's not going directly to the Pope's desk, although sometimes it can, it certainly is going to one of his vicars, specifically the Congregation of Clergy, now called the Dicastery of Clergy. I still don't know why they changed the names. You tell me the difference between the congregation and the dicastery, you should win the lottery, because I don't know the difference. But tell us a little bit about that process that now you've started the hierarchical recourse and your faculties have been given back to you because the case is pending. What does that look like from your perspective, from a priest's perspective? Go through those steps for us.
So, to live and to live one's life as a priest freely requires um, all of um, the powers given to a priest in his ordination and the the authority to hear confessions. Um, those things, in order to function fully as a priest, you need to have those things. And when when the appeal was submitted and they were returned to me, it was the most liberating thing because from the moment the decree of excommunication was promulgated against me, I could no longer access the sacraments. Not not only could I not say mass, I couldn't receive the Blessed Sacrament at a mass that I assisted at, not celebrated. So it was a tremendous um, spiritual relief to have been given that opportunity to submit the appeal to hierarchical course. So, and it's funny. Even though the fact of the matter was that all those censures issued against me were put in suspense because of the appeal to hierarchical course, it would take me months before I realized, oh, that's included. So for almost a year and a half, it didn't even occur to me to put on clerics or don my cassock.
Mm.
It simp I the shock of having those severe actions taken against me was so intense that it took probably 18 months before I began to fully live out my priesthood again.
And ladies and gentlemen, I just want to let you know that when Father Treco came to the coalition for help about 2.5 years ago, I did not know him. And we just found it so odd that he was excommunicated. And we kept looking because we do background checks. We kept looking to see, well, what did he do? Because clearly giving a sermon and a sermon that was published by the Remnant newspaper does not qualify one to be excommunicated. One, Michael Matt would never publish something that had heresy. And so we kept looking and digging and asking you, and you're providing us all this information. I remember you told me one time, you said, I've never met an organization that was so thorough. And, sadly, now that organization has imploded and is really doing no work whatsoever. But this man, this priest that's in front of you that I'm interviewing, ladies and gentlemen, he was excommunicated. And to be honest with you, and I want to speak to this a little bit, it seems like the bishop almost did that to get it completely off of his desk. Because when a bishop excommunicates you, it's he doesn't have to deal with you anymore. He doesn't have to pay you, doesn't have to give you insurance. He can just let you go. And what's sad is that this is happening in the context of a married priest who has a family. And yeah, it's been kicked up to Rome because of hierarchical recourse, but that takes years. That is something that's an ongoing process. So I mean, how do you as a priest that is the recipient of this excommunication, you've already told us the relief, and it took you almost 18 months to come to the realization of that relief, not only to celebrate mass, but just to do the simple things of receiving communion. Because technically an excommunicant cannot even receive communion
Right.
according to confession.
But you can't.
How
You have,
how do you deal with that?
well, for the period of time from the promulgation of the decree of excommunication and the submission of the appeal to hierarchical recourse, that was a very heavy and dark time. Um, and to know um, clearly that these actions were taken against me unjustly didn't really lighten the weight of it any. In fact, in a sense, it intensified it. Um, but what's really, really important to understand is when that appeal was submitted, um, other things kicked in. So if I had submitted no appeal, then the bishop, like you said, his hands were free of me. But the moment that appeal was submitted, the bishop was now obligated until Rome issued a judgment to pay for my livelihood at a level comparable to what other priests would have received, and Bishop Lopes has failed to do that. So we gave him a few months, appealed to him about that, and he ignored our appeals, and so we then submitted another appeal, this one to the Congregation with the Clergy. The appeal to hierarchical recourse is actually submitted to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, but the appeal for the restoration of remuneration um, was submitted to now what is called the dicastery for clergy. So, as far as the code is concerned, Bishop Lopes is not free of me, but that in the practical order, that seems not to matter.
It seems like he's been watching too many movies and TV shows about what obedience is, and I highly recommend to our audience to read True Obedience by Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, who's always been a great supporter and friend to the canceled priests, because we have to realize that obedience is a two-way streak. It really is. If we can move a little bit, you are a married priest that has embraced tradition. You celebrate the traditional mass exclusively. However, you, like many priests I've met in my lifetime, whether Eastern or Western priests, you are one of those priests that doesn't believe that priests should be married, uh, even though you are a married priest. Um, a lot of people think that the solution to all the problems in the priesthood today is if, well, we just let them get married, everything will be fine. And I could tell you as a celibate priest, I've heard too many confessions, and I can guarantee you that would not fix the problem. But I want to pick your brain a little bit about celibacy, marriage, and why you think, as a married priest, both in East and West, should not be married.
Yeah. So, it's a fascinating thing when I converted to Catholicism from the Anglican tradition, um, and my sense of call to priesthood did not diminish. That was not really that was not like a thrilling thing for me. I really wished it had just gone away because I had met other men who had been Anglican priests, and they told me it's almost immediately upon becoming a Catholic, being received into the church, the sense of call to priesthood went away. Um, and that was not the case in my situation. But the question the bishops had asked me on two occasions, has it dissipated? And when I gave the answer, no, I said to the second bishop, um, it would have really been nice if it did because my life would be simple, much simpler. But what I found was that when the lay faithful heard that uh, I was approved for formation as a Catholic priest by Rome, um, they were delighted. In fact, I said, "This is what we need. This will help the priesthood. This will solve so many problems in the priesthood if more men like you we could have more priests married." And I looked at him and I said, "That's why do you think that will solve things?" I said, "I have 3 children, right? Would you want to go through puberty with my children? Do you want all of the complexities of family life to be at the heart of your parish?" And almost immediately, people hesitated. And then I would ask them the practical question. I said, "Well, okay, let's say the mark is a celibate priest can give 100% of his time to Christ and his service to the church. 100%. What percentage of married priest time do you think a man can give?" And they said, "Okay, so maybe about 50%." And I said, "Really?" I said, I would propose to you that the amount of time that a married priest can give, dedicate exclusively to the living of priestly life, and I'm talking about a married priest who has children, right? Um, I think it's close to the 25%, where I mean exclusively dedicated to his priestly life. I said the demands of being a father, the demands of being a husband are such that they consume a large proportion of a man's life. So if you wanted to get the equivalent, I would say, if you wanted to get the equivalent of one celibate who's dedicated to the priesthood, you'd probably need 3 or 4 married priests. And then I told a story about a woman who I had met when I was still a Protestant, and she was a Greek Orthodox. And she was telling me the story about um, their parish. And she said, in our parish, there's a direct relationship between when our parish thrived and when our parish simply s- held its own, so to speak. And she said, whenever we had a celibate priest, our parish thrived. But whenever we had received a married priest, it sort of just held its own and she said, because the fact of the matter is family life is really demanding on a man. And so he cannot be for the church that exclusive, he cannot serve the church exclusively. And I was sort of smiling because she's echoing what St. Paul said when he writes. He said, um, would that all men were like me. And he's talking about being celibate, because the husband is distracted by the concerns of life. Celibates don't have that distraction. They can give themselves more fully to Christ. So in the practical order, even without reviewing the history of celibacy in the church, it just makes sense to me.
I think it makes sense practically. Let's put aside historically, which in the Roman Rite, there's no evidence that there's ever been married clergy. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear people out there, some of them very good apologists, say, well, marriage was kind of allowed up until the 800s or 900s, even in Rome. There's no evidence of that at all, that the Diocese of Rome allowed for a married presbyterate. All right. You can hold to that opinion. You're not a heretic for thinking that there might have been married clergy, but there's actually no evidence. And there's actually more evidence to see that celibacy is of apostolic origin, similar to the Roman canon for the Roman Rite, and we have to keep that in mind. But there has been given by John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI an indult to allow priests that have to be ordained, that have converted, who are ministers in other faiths. And we already heard from Father Treco that he converted from Anglicanism to the Catholic Church and still felt that calling to be a priest. And it was a very drawn out process. I mean, you converted in 2000. It wasn't until 2015 that you were ordained a priest. So it wasn't like this was just done 2 weeks later.
Right.
And you had extensive training, specifically one-on-one. But just a couple of practical questions that I have as a celibate priest. And I know how much the traditional breviary takes up my time. Are you required to pray the entire office every day?
Well, in the ordinariate, the the entire breviary is not the entire office is not required of priests. But since my excommunication, or since I put it like this, since I was thrust from the ordinariate and into tradition, um, one of the first things that began to dawn on me was to live my priestly life fully, even though I'm not obligated to pray the entire breviary, the entire office. That is something I should deliberately take up, and that takes a lot of time.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, the traditional breviary takes at least an hour. And if you're able to say the entire breviary for the day in an hour, you're booking it. I mean, you're going at a pretty fast clip. We're talking more about 90 minutes, even longer than that, especially if it's a major feast day with all the readings.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, and I don't think a lot of people, even in our audience, realize that a priest and a religious, for the longest time in the church, was always obligated to pray 150 psalms a week.
Yes.
And we're encouraged to still pray the rosary, just as you are. Even though the rosary is called the poor man's breviary. And so when you take that into consideration, we're as priests, we are also, I don't know if it's an obligation, but it's about as close as it comes to an obligation to set aside time to pray and meditate on scripture, Lectio Divina,
Yes.
20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So when you factor all these things in, and then actually having a job, people don't realize that when you're a pastor of a parish, or the assistant, the parochial vicar, or if you're teaching in the high school, that's the priest's job. His vocation is the priesthood. But what he does from 9 to 5 is just like anybody else. He still has to work. And St. Paul says it so beautifully. There are people out there that aren't willing to work. Don't feed them, And at times, St. Paul even went back to making tents. That was his profession, as when he was a Pharisee, when he was still in Judaism. And so we see this. So you see all these obligations. And when people tell me, oh, your life would just be so much better if you were married. And I could somewhat understand where they're coming from, because it is our natural vocation. It is the natural vocation of every man and woman to be married. And celibacy is that supernatural calling. It is to live as we are going to live in heaven.
Yes.
There is no marriage in heaven.
There's no marriage in heaven.
Except for the Lamb and its church.
Yeah.
But there's still priests in heaven.
Yeah.
I will still be a priest in heaven. You and your wonderful wife will not be married in heaven, but you'll still be a family, obviously, but you'll still be a priest in heaven. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. And we have to realize that as a married priest, you would be the first person to say, under no circumstances, allow this as a general rule.
Yes.
And it's funny that you say that because I've even met Eastern Rite priests, Byzantine, Ukrainian, Melkite, who say the same thing.
Yeah. And it makes entire sense. I mean, if you if you are married and you love and care for your wife, let's just start there. Um, then it will immediately show you the demands of the priesthood will immediately create a kind of tension in your life, your familial life, because especially in emergency situations, when a priest gets a call, he doesn't consult his wife to say, can I take this call and leave because somebody's dying? That's not how it works. You know, when a priest gets called to an emergency situation, it doesn't matter what time, where they are, he gets up and he goes and he responds to the needs of the faithful. That's what a shepherd does. And so that creates a scenario where um, the demands of the priesthood press into the natural obligations a man has towards his wife and his children. And it's very important for a married priest to constantly reaffirm the, the 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 his love for his wife, and despite the conflicting obligations that lie at the heart of his very life. And this is reciprocal too. Um, when when I was deprived of the fellowship of priests because of my situation, um, there was a period after 6 or 7 months, my wife says to me, she said, Vaughn, you need to be with other priests. There are aspects of your life and your soul that I simply have no capacity to meet. Not that I wouldn't wish to help you, but you need the communion of brother priests.
If I could interject for a second, though, I can tell you, as a priest of 18 years, I'm 45 years old, I've had friends get married my age. I've taught students who've gotten married. I have noticed, and I'm saying this a little tongue in cheek, I have noticed that the longer people are married, the more willingly the wife is like, "Oh, you wanna take a boys' weekend? Go ahead." "No, go ahead. You don't even have to call me, just send a text, 'I love you,' that's fine." Where when you first get married, the couple's inseparable, they're doing everything together. But as the years go by, a little bit less of that. It's more of, "Oh, you wanna go out and have a girls' weekend? Have fun.
Yeah.
Wanna go have a boys' weekend? Have fun." And one thing that I noticed specifically with you, to get on a more serious note, is that you were thoroughly enjoying being accepted by a group of men that are celibates, odd men in my opinion, and I include myself in on that. But your opinion was just as validated as everyone else, just as valid in their eyes. And I remember you telling me that afterwards. You're going to go back home here in a few days because we're all here in Santos Ranch, having fellowship. But you're going to go back probably more enthused about being a priest than just us regular celibates, because you realize the joy that can be found in celibacy.
Yep.
And, it's often people say to me, "Well, I don't know how you do that. Celibacy seems to be a sacrifice," and it is. But what people fail to realize sometimes, and I know this from personal experience because I hear confessions, is that marriage is a sacrifice.
The church used to use the language of austerity,
Mhm,
that marriage is an austere sacrament.
mhm.
Because it is so demanding, right? That it requires constant self-mortification. If you are going to be a good husband, then you have to discipline yourself. You have, if you are going to live for your wife and your children, that means you must choose not to live for yourself. That means you are willingly depriving yourself of things that you might say you need
Yeah.
so that they can have what they need.
If we could talk about a subject that's been in the news recently, we're recording this episode, part 2 of our interview, on the feast of Saint Stephen, King of Hungary. Saint Stephen did something that I think a lot of modern Catholics would find odd. He mandated in his kingdom that everyone either become a priest or religious or get married. Everyone had to do one of the 3, basically priest, religious life, or marriage. Because priesthood, ladies and gentlemen, is technically a separate vocation from religious life. That seems odd because you even have on so-called conservative shows like Pints with Aquinas, Matt Fradd, who I personally like Matt Fradd a lot. I mean, I think he does a lot of good work. I don't agree with everything, but that's okay. I think as Catholics, we have to realize, um, it's okay that you don't agree with everybody on everything. But he did have, a guest on, Voice of Reason, um, who sadly, has ran into some trouble of his own, and pray for him. Um, I didn't really know that gentleman. I think his name was Alex, at least his first name. He's an apologist. Uh, First time I ever heard of him or even saw him was on Pints with Aquinas, and I don't want to get into what happened with him. That's been covered enough. But one thing that hasn't been covered enough is they're sitting there as they normally do. Matt Fradd does with Pints with Aquinas. They're smoking cigars and talking about different things. And at one point, Voice of Reason says, Alex says, well, I don't think I'm called to be married. I think I'm called to the single life. And I found it quite odd that Matt Fradd, who considers himself a Thomist, just went along with that. Didn't have a problem with that because even in the modern catechism, you will find no mention of single life as a vocation.
Right.
It's definitely not a permanent vocation. All of us are called, if you're going to use the modern language, all of us are called either to priesthood, marriage, or the consecrated life. Now, the consecrated life has a lot of different variety to it. A consecrated life could mean a Benedictine monk, could be a poor cleric, but it could also be a hermit. It could be a consecrated virgin living in the world. What do you see as a problem that so many Catholics, even those supposed apologists who should know better, are embracing something that's not really part of Catholic teaching, which is the single life?
Um, I think it's tragic. It's tragic on all sorts of levels. First of all, I think it's tragic because the to embrace the idea of a single life as something normative, because that's what's being floated, right? That it's a decision that you can make without without any considered reflection on what it means actually to be a man or a woman before God. And to to be faithful to the church's understanding of the purpose of human existence, um, I don't think it leaves us the option to just opt for single life. We can we can the church presses us to consider um, to devote our lives entirely to Christ in one of several ways. We can devote our lives entirely to Christ within the vocation of marriage, which involves that devotion then involves a deep self-giving of one life to another. And that is a critical aspect of a person's formation because rooted in the human heart after the fall is a kind of self-centeredness that each of the vocations call out against. Marriage calls out against it because we must live in the natural order for others and their benefit. the consecrated life does the same thing regardless of its particular setting, because it calls us to live our life for the glory of Christ, for um, the good of the church through prayer and service. And then the priesthood, secular priesthood, similarly does the same thing. So each of the vocations are like a call away from that self-centeredness that is rooted in every human heart.
I also think that every vocation is one of self-sacrifice. It's self-giving to someone else.
Yes.
My wife is the congregation. My wife is the church as a celibate priest. You have it very difficult because, in one sense, you have a wife and then you also have another wife.
Yes.
And uh, not that it's polygamy in any sense of the word, but, one thing that I said when I taught high school is that we're all called to be fathers and mothers.
Yes.
And how that fatherhood, how that motherhood is lived out is going to be different, but we're all called to be fathers and mothers. That's our vocation. I mean, and think of some of the great mothers in our lifetimes. We're celibate women. Mother Angelica, Mother
Yeah.
Teresa. All right. There was a reason they were called mother. It's a reason why sisters are religious are called sisters. There's a reason why fathers are called fathers. It's not because we see ourselves as being better or above others. Okay. And we have to get back to this idea of what a hierarchy really is, one of service. There's often talks, Pope Benedict um, took out a title of the Holy Father of the Bishop of Rome, Patriarch of the West. He took that out because he saw that the Pope being over the entire church, that's saying Patriarch of the West, kind of limited him. Pope Francis put it back in. Pope Francis took out the title Vicar of Christ. I think now Pope Leo's put that back in. But there's one title that they've never, ever gotten rid of. And it's the greatest title that I think you could give to the Holy Father, to the Pope, the servant of the servants of God. And we have to realize that our vocation, whether it's to the priesthood, whether it's to marriage, whether we're a man, whether we're a woman, it's about giving.
Yeah.
And it being at service of another.
Yeah. And when I think about marriage, the Saint so the greatest vision of marriage we were given in the scriptures comes to us from a celibate. And St. Paul is reflecting, trying to instruct the faithful um, with regards to what it means to be a husband, right? And the language he uses is striking. He says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and laid down his life for her."
Yeah.
The vision St. Paul has of a man in relating to his wife is he must so live that he, in a sense, dies for the love of her and for her beauty. He dies to himself so that she can live. Yeah. And so at the heart of each of the vocations is that kind of self-death.
Start thinking about this. You just mentioned this. When we start taking that approach to vocation, that approach to treating women, then we can understand the traditional understanding of why we don't want altar girls. I call it female altar boys.
Yes.
That it's actually a disservice to them as a woman to let them serve.
Yes.
Okay. Is that their genius as women, the feminine genius is to be served, for us to lay down as men, to lay down our lives for them. And, this whole idea of married priests in general, of women priests, they don't realize this isn't what they're called to do, and they're told the opposite. They're told the greatest vocation on earth is not that great. That is to be a mother. We can't do that.
Yep.
We cannot do that. And they're told to stay at home, to be a quote unquote homemaker is somehow a bad thing.
Yes.
But again, if you look at some of the greatest saints, you know, they were known women saints. They were known because of the families that they built up.
Yes.
And we have to see this. And, I have to give a shout out, uh, Dan 70's wife, Jennifer. I mean, you see her in her work here, whether it's feeding us priests, whether it's taking care of her children, some would say unruly children. Matthias is still paying attention, so that's good. So, that, I mean, she's just constantly at work, but there's a joy that I see radiating from her.
Yes.
There's a joy I've seen radiating from your wife, Norma, now that she's a grandmother, because you're empty nesters.
Yes, we are.
So it's a little bit easier for you to be a married priest
Yes.
and still serve, because your children are out of the house. But I think we need to get back to the sense of this is why parents should be praying that God will call one of their children to religious life or to the priesthood, and sometimes both. Because again, religious life, you can be a priest. For example, the Dominicans or the Benedictines, just to name two examples. But I think it's important that parents do that. What I see today, and not unjustly, and I want to get your thought on this, you have a lot of parents who are going, I don't want my children in that mess. And when you think about it, I don't blame them. I mean, I am hesitant as a priest to say to a young man like Matthias, our producer, you should really think about the priesthood. Now he's told me that he has, but you're almost worried because you don't want him to go through the same thing you went through. And as priests, we kind of have to rise above that and go, yeah, I've been canceled. Yeah, I've been treated very badly. This is the cross that I've been given. But in the end, no matter what happens, we have a great life,
Yeah.
because this is the cross Christ gave us. So no matter what our vocation is, I just want to kind of touch on that and get your thoughts.
Yes. The idea, like my being canceled, has not had the effect that you that described. Though, if anything, it's intensified my appreciation for the priesthood and its value for the church. It has sharpened my words of encouragement when I encourage men to consider the priesthood. Um, that to the degree I say, but you have to be armed and ready. You have to know that if our Lord calls you to the priesthood, that does not mean your life is going to be easy, right? To be faithful as a priest today in the church could put you in the crosshairs of your bishop, depending on who your bishop is. And that's something you just have to face. That is might be the kind of cross God will call you to take. And then I remember something my son Michael said to me when I was preparing for priesthood. He called me aside and said, "Dad, you really want to do this?" He's because this is in the midst of the crisis, and he said, "You realize that you could get ordained tomorrow, and somebody accuse you on Friday, and your whole life is turned over."
Yeah.
And I looked at him and I said, "No one chooses to become a priest to avoid trouble."
And let's go a step further. No one chooses for himself to become a priest
Yes, exactly.
because it's a supernatural call.
That's right.
And when you look at the ordination rite, old and new, okay, it is clearly the church saying, calling you.
Yes.
We were told, we were given letters. You have to report to the cathedral at this time on this date in order to be ordained.
Yes.
And the only time that there should ever be clapping is when the bishop is asking these questions at the ordination and asking the church, which is the laity out in the pew, you find these men worthy to be ordained? Shall we ordain them? Shall the church ordain
Yes.
these priests? And they give their consent by applause.
Right.
And it's for anyone that's been at an ordination, it's done very well, in my opinion. It's not the hooting and hollering that you sometimes get at some of these clown masses. But yeah, people don't realize this, that, if it was up to me, if if I got to choose what my vocation would be, it would probably be a Carthusian monk. Not just for the chartreuse. All right. but it would be a Carthusian monk because when you look at it from an academic point of view, why wouldn't anyone want to be a Carthusian monk? To live in a cell, to be alone with God, to have some community, but not a lot, and just to live that life. And then you have to realize, but this is why vocation should never be romanticized. And I mean that in the bad sense, not in a good sense, obviously. Romance for marriage is very important, but, we shouldn't romanticize our vocation. And we should realize that this is a gift given to us at baptism by God,
Yeah.
and that our role, our job, for lack of a better term, is to discover what that is. And so if you are single, all right, that is a temporary vocation. Yeah, we all start off single until we discover what God
That
wants
was
us
right.
to do.
Yes.
So, Father, we just have a couple of more minutes. Is there any message of hope that you want to give to the audience before we sign off?
Yes, when I think about my own difficulties as a priest, or the difficulties that have been thrust upon me as a priest, the thing that's keeps sounding in my heart is my the gift of priesthood to me has been worth all of the trials that have been placed in my lap because of that priesthood. There's no regrets here. I Not one day occurs when I say I wish I had not paid attention to God. And so I could say to young men considering asking God if He is calling them to priesthood, I can say to them, no matter what trial your priesthood brings to you, it will not rob you of your joy of being a priest. It cannot, because that joy does not arise from you. That joy arises from Christ.
Well said. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's a perfect way to end this episode of Hope in the Desert. Again, many thanks to Matthias Seveny for producing the show. Please like and subscribe. Until next time, God bless.